The terrorist bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 on December 21st, 1988 will never fade from memory. Every new act of terrorism in the world evokes again our shock on that day 10 years ago. Everywhere we look and listen, there they are. Images flashing on the TV screens, called up on the radios, photographs reprinted in the magazines. The blue and white crushed cockpit of the so mythically named Maid of the Seas on the Scottish green, the center of a picturesque village turned to flames, that dark pit of ash. And there we are again, torn in pieces through the heart of our lives.
$259 passengers and crew from 21 nations were on Pan American Airlines Flight 103. When it exploded air, there were no survivors. When it crashed into Lockerbie, Scotland, 11 more perished in a fiery havoc on the ground. Burning jet fuel and smoldering wreckage, and 270 bodies to be accounted for. 35 of the dead were students from Syracuse University in upstate New York.
For teachers of the students on Flight 103, and for those who knew them, our grief is not only for those among us who have died. We grieve also for ourselves, for that part of us that is so much less now without them. This story has become our story. We feel our obligations as witnesses. It is our story just as surely as it is engraved in stone on the place of remembrance as part of the story of this great university, of the village of Lockerbie, the story of each of the 270 stones in the Pan American Flight 103 memorial cairn at Arlington National Cemetery. And what can we say about our story? That we know grief like hands reaching in and squeezing our insides, as the mother of one of my murdered students describes. That we know the injustice, not only caused by bombs and by the surely anguished souls who build them and plant them. As poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote in his elegy, we listen to the voice of the wind and the ceaseless message that forms itself out of silence. We hear it murmuring toward us now, from those who died young.
Disaster at Christmas. Pan Am 103 never makes it home.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. The simple facts are these. Pan Am's Flight 103 had been in the air for an hour. The 747...
Seen crashing into the Scottish town of Lockerbie, near Scotland's border with England.
It was much the same as any other day, really, in Scotland. Perhaps milder than usual, cloudy, mild, breezy, rain, typical Scottish weather. The townsfolk were making their final preparations for their Christmas holidays. Little did they know, or little did I know, that at that time 259 people were preparing to fly across the Atlantic to spend Christmas with their families.
Very little hope, I would have thought, for anybody who was in that plane.
And then there's the terrific bang, of course, when this part of the plane hit the ground. 60 to 80 yards away from where we were in the house at the time. Fire all over the place. In my car, there was fire underneath the car. His car was in his drive, but that fire's underneath.
Dozens of houses are burning, and the fire brigade are being hampered in their attempts to put out the fires by the risk of a further explosion from the petrol station, which the Pan Am Jumbo hit as it crashed into the town.
So I dashed back in the house and got some saucepans filled with water and put the fires out underneath the cars, and then I went round to where I could see where the main damage was, where this big crater eventually appeared in the daylight, and helped to get people out of burning houses and so on.
I was in Glasgow. I was in the main production office of BBC Scotland the night it happened. It was very confused because we didn't know exactly what had happened. The initial report suggested that it was a military jet which had crashed into a petrol station, and that seemed plausible because there were a lot of, that area at the time was used for a lot of low-level military training, and then it began to filter through. It turned out that there were 3 main crash sites, but at the time each reporter thought where they were was the story, and it was very confusing. And then it was a sort of almost disbelief, you know, it cannot possibly have been this, you know, that these things just don't happen.
So I didn't know for 20 minutes or so that it was a passenger plane. My first thought then was, where are all the people from the plane? And of course some were still fastened in their seats. Others were scattered about the countryside, 3.5 miles from Lockerbie, from 3.5 miles away into Lockerbie. One particular farmer had about 92 bodies on his land.
The 747 is bigger, flies farther, and carries more people than any other passenger plane in the world. What had been hundreds of people and thousands of parts, now millions of bits and pieces. Its debris scattered like confetti across 850 square miles. The world took special note of Flight 103. Great Britain launched what is still the largest criminal investigation in British history. America's Federal Aviation Administration estimates the U.S. spent nearly $1.5 billion trying to figure out what happened. When the plane crashed, it hit a raw nerve.
We have been told from a variety of sources, among the people on board were a number of Syracuse University students who were returning from London, where Syracuse University has an overseas program.
Terrorism has happened overseas, has happened in other countries to other people. This was the first one that killed so many Americans, and not only that, it killed so many young Americans, so many, vibrant young 20-year-olds who were in college. And I think that made it why it was so big and why it has remained so large.
In the fall of 1988, Annie LaRue was a young student studying drama in London. Now a decade has passed, and she's had to make a sort of peace with events known to the world as the Lockerbie air disaster.
I had for months premonitions, which I didn't understand. I had a lot of bad dreams of planes blowing up. I kept thinking I was the one that was going to die, and the only person I confided into was Theo, because I thought I was crazy. I thought I was losing it. And she actually...
Theo was your roommate?
Yes, my roommate, my best friend. And she actually wanted me to come with her on this flight because she knew how terrified I was of getting on a plane, because I was having all these visions, and I was shaking a lot, and I didn't know what was going on. And I told her, I said, no, I can't go with you. I've got to get over this. I've got to be stronger than this. This is crazy. It's controlling me, and I don't want to do this. And so I said no, I wasn't going to go. I kept my flight the next day, and I was alone, and I was heaving. I was really panicking and having a panic attack. And I remember going into the bathroom and trying to throw up, and I couldn't. And I needed a distraction. I was all alone. So I turned on the television, thinking that would distract me.
An American is not aware that any of the passengers or crew has survived.
And I screamed. I knew. Boom, I knew right away. I was just loony. I was a loony. And then finally Hank came home, and that's when I told him, and then it all started sort of solidifying that, okay, all these people were on this plane. And I was a robot. For a good week, I was a robot. I mean, we went up to the center. We had a list of all the students, and we were just calmly checking people. Dead, alive, dead,
We'd put
alive.
them in taxis that morning, so we knew who
we
was
knew
there.
who were on it, because we had put them, we'd seen them, so we knew who was dead and who was alive, you know. And it was like otherworldly. And I had to get on a plane 10 hours later to fly home. And, I don't really remember. They put me in a wheelchair to get me on this plane. And I did not cry until I got back to the United States about 48 hours later. I did not come to until I talked to Theo's mother, and she asked me to kill her. Theo's mother asked me to kill her because she couldn't live without her daughter. And then I was like, okay, that was it. And I lost it. And I sort of came to finally.
Stood on our tiptoes, we could peek over the sill, and once in a while we would see a girl slowly walking up the hill.
Jessica Frankel was there too, and like Annie, she lost real friends on that plane. Friends she had studied with, practiced with, and explored with for months and years. Friends like Miriam Wolf.
I mean, a real transformation took place. She, blossomed. She just did. She became this, not this other person, but something happened to her when she was there. As lonely as I am without her, and there is, a real void, it's the parents. It's just thinking about those parents that just sends me, over the edge.
Susa Lowenstein is one of those parents. She is also an artist. 10 years after losing her 20-year-old son, she still feels the anguish of the experience, and she still uses the same words to describe how her life changed forever when her boy Alexander died in the crash.
Well, I was in my studio working, interestingly, on a sculpture for which Alexander had posed before leaving for London.
The phone rang, and it was a young friend. And the way she spoke was very slowly and very hesitantly. And she said, "Hello, Mrs. Lowenstein, how are you?" "Fine." She said, "Is Alexander home?" And I said, "No, not yet, but he's coming home tonight."
And I remember that she spoke very slowly and in a very probing way. And then she asked, "Do you know what airline he's flying?"
And all I remember hearing was Pan Am Flight 103 was last seen in the fireball over Scotland, and I knew my boy was gone. I'm sorry. I knew I would never see him again.
Channeling that agony, Susa Lowenstein created a powerful series of sculptures. She took sorrow and thousands of hours and expressed herself through art. The result, Dark Elegy, a striking symbol of the torment and frustration of loss. The word elegy means poem or song of lament, and the dead. In the aftermath of Flight 103, Susa Lowenstein asked victims' families to pose in memory of their lost loved ones, and more than 100 women responded.
She looks so vulnerable.
She brought each to her studio and asked them to re-experience their loss. She brought them back to the first moment they heard the devastating news.
It didn't matter if these women came to me 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years after. They all knew exactly, to the smallest detail, what happened at that moment, and that is really what I portray.
What had started as a personal coping mechanism has now taken on a life of its own. So far, Susa Lowenstein has finished 54 sculptures and has sent them traveling to town halls, galleries, libraries, parks, and universities. She plans to one day donate Dark Elegy to the United Nations, but for now it brings her comfort as the sculptures stand alone on a large lawn by the water near the Lowensteins' home. More than a decade passed, Sousa and Peter Lowenstein want more than the comfort dark elegy brings.
We want to see justice done. We want to see these two men brought to trial.
Soon after the crash of Flight 103, the joint team of American and British investigators begins to have suspicions. Though no group ever admits responsibility, within a week, the team knows the crash is more than a tragedy. It's terrorism. Authorities question more than 15,000 people and seek evidence in more than 30 countries. But the only sure way to find out what happened is to find all the aircraft fragments and fit them together like pieces of a giant 3D jigsaw puzzle. As the reconstructed plane takes shape, authorities learn where and why the disintegration began. A Simtex plastic explosive detonated in the forward cargo hold of the giant aircraft, the neck of the plane, between the cockpit and the fuselage.
This cannot be considered a mere misfortune. This was deliberate murder. And while all of us have to strive for reconciliation in our hearts, we must also pursue justice and accountability.
The crash had the world's attention, but stubbornly the cause and culprits remained a mystery for 3 years. Despite the largest reward ever offered by the U.S. government, it might never have been solved. But finally, there was a break. The FBI uncovered a key piece of evidence. It was a fingernail-sized sliver off a computer microchip. In a remarkable triumph of forensics, the Bureau's crime laboratory identified it as coming from a bomb timer. A timer identical to another one discovered in a bomb taken from Libyan agents 10 months before Flight 103. And only one company in the world made the kind of bomb timer used in both explosives. Between 1985 and 86, it shipped every timer it made to Libya.
I mean, we know who did it, we know where they are, there are indictments out for them, there are sanctions against Libya.
In 1991, Scotland's chief law officer obtained a warrant for 2 suspects. They were Abdel Basit Ali al-Megrahi and Lamin Khalifa Fima. Both were alleged Libyan intelligence agents. Both were alleged terrorists. The bomb had been traced to a radio cassette recorder. The recorder had been traced to a suitcase, and clothing within the suitcase had been traced back to Malta. That's where the wanted men were based and where investigators think the bomb was planted.
I'm pleased to announce that I have just spoken to Hans Corell, who has informed me of the safe arrival in the Netherlands of the 2 Libyan nationals accused of destroying Pan Am Flight 103.
Now, 2 of the most wanted men of the century are finally going to trial. After years of stalling, this month, Libya turned the suspects over to international authorities, though they still maintain their innocence. Now they'll have a chance to prove it under Scottish law. But first, they'll have to cool their heels a little longer while their legal cases are prepared.
They are agents of the Libyan government. So I think that's the point, that if it's going to be a true criminal trial, intent and motive have to be brought up. And if it goes the chain of command, whoever is responsible, it has to be brought up.
Since long before anyone had ever heard of Flight 103, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi was Libya's political leader. In fact, his designated title means simply the leader. If blowing up the airliner was a political statement by a political leader, and in the absence of a trial this has never been proven, but if it was, why was it done? There are those who believe Libya sought revenge against the United States for earlier acts of aggression.
I feel very strongly that the timing of this was part of the message. That that the terrorists wanted to make sure that there were ordinary citizens on board.
Joan Deppa is a professor at Syracuse University. For her and others who have studied the crash, one of the biggest lingering questions is the question of motive.
And that was part of retaliation, either for the attack in Libya that came against the place where some of Gaddafi's family were staying, or the attack on the Iranian Airbus that killed a whole bunch of women and children and families.
4 years before Flight 103, the United States launched an ill-fated effort to overthrow the military dictatorship in Libya. Caught in the crossfire was Gaddafi's 18-month-old adopted daughter, Hannah. Then only 5 months before Flight 103, a U.S. warship in the Middle East misidentified an Iran Air passenger plane and shot it down, killing 290. Many were Arab pilgrims headed to Mecca. The Persian Gulf was awash with talk of revenge. But was one of these the motive? Both? Or something else altogether? It's a question that maybe not even a trial can answer. But regardless of who bombed Pan Am Flight 103 and for what reason, the unintended victims of the Lockerbie air disaster were the residents of Lockerbie. The aircraft was a half-hour late leaving Heathrow Airport. Had it been on time, the bomb would have exploded over the Atlantic Ocean and its wreckage would have sunk to the bottom of the sea. Had the explosives detonated even seconds earlier or later, the neighborhood of Sherwood Crescent might have been spared. Instead, Flight 103 fell from 6 miles up, demolishing 21 houses, killing their occupants, and unhinging the town's pre-Christmas reverie. A 200-foot-long crater took its place, and for a while, it changed everything.
The fires are out now, the gutted and flattened houses looking like a scene from the Blitz. There had been no warning, there could have been no escape. And with Lockerbie in the wild and remote border country, the chances of an aircraft hitting any settlement or a town of this size were thousands to 1 against.
December 21st is the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. But for Lockerbie, that day became the longest. The Scottish town of only a few thousand was instantly turned into an international symbol of human inhumanity. Emergency workers rushed in from around the region but found few injuries to treat. Everyone aboard the plane was dead, and most hit by falling wreckage were killed on the spot. Only the most gruesome job remained, the inevitable, the unenviable task of cleaning up.
You can be trained to respond physically, but mentally and spiritually and emotionally, you can't be trained for something like that.
From day one, they were just there for us. They lost 11 people in Lockerbie and never dwelled on it. It was as though they lost no one. They just took care of us. They rounded up 800 square miles worth of debris from Pan Am 103 and returned every article that they could identify to the rightful owner. Washed, ironed, packaged. They're exceptional people.
I've met people in Lockerbie when I was down there filming with the reporter who responded in a way I feel very proud of as a Scot. And I've met people in the States who've told me what people in Scotland and people in Lockerbie have done, which I find remarkable and heartening. So a testament to the human spirit.
My feeling is that as horrible as it was, thank God it happened over Scotland.
From the start, the people of Lockerbie bonded with the families of Flight 103 victims, but they had a much harder time understanding the international media.
I think the media initially painted the picture that Lockerbie was devastated.
Well, Lockerbie wasn't devastated. It had 3 areas of damage. The shops were still functioning, the banks were still functioning. You couldn't use the telephone, of course, by this time. All the telephone lines were jammed. But other than that, there were just these 3 areas. But it was very difficult to move around without being asked by the media, radio or television, would you give an interview, and so on and so on and so on. And really at that time, that was the last thing we wanted to do. We didn't want that at all.
A change for the better in some ways. Information moved fast, really fast. It took disaster reporting to new lows.
So you start going helter-skelter looking for something that will make pictures. And the fact that you can go live tempts you to do things that you wouldn't do otherwise. You've invested in the equipment. You know audiences like live, so here we go.
Joan Deppa teaches journalism. When she and 3 of her colleagues wrote The Media and Disasters, they argued that the story behind the headlines was in the intrusive way some of them conducted themselves in the disaster aftermath.
people in the media use grief to get the attention of the audience the same way that pornographers use sex to get people's attention. They were really using it because it was compelling television. When you heard her scream, you had to look.
The media descended upon Lockerbie in great numbers, and I'm sorry to say that some of them really went over the score in subsequent days, posing as social workers even to try and get into people's houses to interview them.
And it was just because what you have to understand is that we were grieving in public, because everywhere we went there was a camera. My phone rang off the hook with radio people wanting to talk to me. Every time we went to a memorial service, you came out and there was a camera in your face. So you couldn't, and I mean, we saw, Hank and I in London saw Theo's parents find out on television. We saw Nicole's mother collapse in an airport in Kennedy, and we were in London. I mean, it was so public.
Within an hour of it happening.
Right. And we had to turn it off. I mean, we couldn't deal.
We turned the TV
So it was those quiet moments that were really important, because we could be who we are. We weren't anyone's point of grief. We were just us, and we were just grieving for our loss.
Professor Deppa is careful not to portray all journalists as insensitive. She knows from experience. She worked for a news wire service for 13 years.
Always tempting to paint the media with a broad brush, usually in the blackest of colors. But there were people in the chapel that night who were behaving with a great deal of sensitivity, and but there were also people who behaved as if they were covering some sort of rugby match.
If the media in the United States were in a frenzy, it was at least partially because the media handlers were not organized either. Professor Deppa says Pan Am in particular was not very well prepared. Some families never received notification of their relative's death. Others received that notification in the form of an answering machine message left by the airline. Professor Deppa knows how she would grade the airline's public relations effort.
Is there an F-? They screwed up royally.
Deppa points out that Pan American Airlines had had disasters before and knew that terrorism was a real threat. Hijackings had been a force to reckon with for 2 decades before Flight 103.
Someday one of these was going to go dreadfully, dreadfully wrong. You would have to have a plan. How are you going to handle it? And instead they've been laying off PR people. They'd been ignoring this. They were down to a skeleton staff. They had no plan for dealing with this, and they kidded themselves that you couldn't have a plan for it.
Meanwhile, in Lockerbie, authorities reacted to the tragedy much differently, much better.
And who could have predicted that an airliner is going to fall out of the sky, be blown out of the sky by terrorists over Scotland? Couldn't be predicted. But they had been working on all sorts of disasters, including aviation disasters, and how would we handle it? They had a plan in place. They did an excellent job.
But the American government, perhaps the most media-savvy organization in the world, did not handle the disaster nearly as well.
They get another F-. They screwed this up so royally. The State Department actually has gone through major overhaul of its policies in the wake of Pan Am 103. They worked with the families to try to understand what was needed, and so they've made major revisions.
Of course, there would have been no need for effective public relations if Pan Am had discovered the bomb before it blew up. For that failure, the airline went bankrupt, and the airline industry learned a valuable lesson. It wasn't what Pan Am did, but what it didn't do.
Well, they didn't do any security. They didn't do the minimum things they were supposed to be doing. They didn't reconcile bags with passengers because the bag that had a bomb in it didn't have a passenger. Not only didn't they have 100% chance of being protected, they had no chance of being protected.
How would you
That shouldn't happen again to anybody.
That lapse in security was also, in fact, a breach of federal regulations. And considering that Pan Am had just received a bomb threat, perhaps also a breach of common sense. At the time of the tragedy, government aviation organizations around the world required airlines to match all bags with passengers. For failing to do so, Pan American Airlines was found guilty of willful misconduct. The insurers had to pay families a multi-million-dollar settlement. In the end, Flight 103 got the attention of the airlines and the FAA.
Well, they've got a lot more money for security, and they put security, it used to be behind the back burner, now at least they have it on the stove.
Before he lost his son Richard on Flight 103, Bob Minetti was an engineer. Now he works for the FAA and helps design stronger aircraft.
Well, it's a good sign because there's been no bigger critic than me, and they've hired me to help with this effort. But there's still an awful long way to go. There are big holes in the security system.
And so perhaps the flight's greatest legacy is a more intense examination of airline safety and security. Last year was the first year that not one life was lost in the crash of any U.S. airliner. What we discovered about ourselves that tragic day may help prevent history from repeating itself.
We will now lay a wreath with all the love we have in our hearts for you. Our love for you is for this day. Our love for you is forever.
Families most affected have learned to cope with the grief and the horror and the helplessness of it all. We can't bring their loved ones back, but we can help bring them justice and help keep their memories alive. That's what I tried to do as a remembrance scholar at Syracuse University, a student among the living, taking time to remember people like me who died 10 years ago. The average age of Flight 103 passengers was only 26 years old. We may never fully understand what happened over Lockerbie and why, but inevitably, somewhere along the way, the world will move on. When that happens, the Lockerbie air disaster will mark a beginning, with better things to come.
Let us begin here, in memory of our beloved students and all who lost their lives, in gratitude to the people of Lockerbie, in honor of all among the living who are earning their miracles. Let us learn to love ourselves as human beings, second only to our gentleness. Let us never in our own lives give in to the rage that blinds us to the spiritual light of gentleness. Let us never stop striving to do away with that prison of terrorism, never, until each woman and man is free. Each man and woman is in the custody of gentleness. Let us take back from terrorism the only power it ever had by refusing ever again to be terrified. Let us surround ourselves with a new symbolism, the blues and greens of gentleness. Let us share now in the blessing of our gentleness.
While you're still in the